Hi everyone, and welcome to our Patreon video for August. So excited to be bringing you a nautical top this summer that we are calling the Mariner top. Now, this was inspired by our Camp Gertie theme, of course. I don't know if you know this, but there used to be troops of Mariner Scouts in the Girl Scouts, and we loved their little nautical uniforms. So I'm so excited to bring you a month of nautical themes. So you can make a blouse. As you see, I'm wearing a sleeveless one. You can also make it with a 3/4 gathered sleeve with a sleeve band. And that was inspired by 20s middy blouses, which I just think are so cute. Of course, the bodice itself is very fitted and inspired by the 50s and sailor dresses of the 50s. And it also has a collar option, and you can do some fun little trim on it. And 2 different bows. We have this knot tie and then the aptly named gigantic bow, which is not for the faint of heart. So this month, this pattern is all about options. It actually reminds me a lot of Night and Day because it has a choose your own adventure feel. There's a lot of different stuff you can do with it. For instance, you can cut it off at the waist. There's a cutting line for you to make a dress bodice, and it interchanges with the Liz and L'Amour skirts. So lots of fun sailor dress options. As I mentioned, you have your sleeve or sleeveless options. You can do it with a collar or without. So without a collar, as you see back here, and no sleeves paired with a L'Amour draped skirt, you have this amazing cocktail dress with princess seams, which I know you guys really like. So even if you're not into our nautical theme, which of course I hope you are, but if you're not, there's a lot of options and things you can do with this pattern. It's a great basic bodice. So all that said, let's dive in and start talking about supplies and the pattern. Okay, everyone, let's talk through the basics of the pattern pieces. Now, with this pattern, I do encourage you to go to the instructions and go to the list of notes because it gives you really specific information on how you would use the different pattern pieces depending on what version of this pattern you're making. For instance, if you're making a dress with a collar, use this facing, etc. There are a lot of choose your own adventure options in this pattern, and I don't want to confuse you too much by going through them all right now, so I'm just going to talk through the pattern in very broad strokes. So just know that all of that information is in the instructions for you. Okay, let's look at the top pieces. So this is a princess seam top, and it's a shoulder princess seam. So if you've never heard that term, it means that this princess seam goes all the way to the shoulder rather than curving over to the armhole, which would be an armhole princess. So it's a very flattering option, and I know you guys love princess seams, so I hope you're excited about this one. So you have your top front, your top side back, and your top center back. Now, a few markings I want you to take note of on these main pattern pieces. You have your waist cutting line. That is if you want to make this into a dress, okay? So that's where you would cut it off and you won't have that cute little peplum-like flare at the bottom. It will end at your natural waist and you'll be able to sew on either the L'Amour or Liz skirts of your choosing. Okay, I also want you to note this circle at the upper back. That's the zipper circle. For almost every iteration that you could make of this pattern, the zipper is going to end at the center back, okay? Up, sort of like your mid back right here underneath the collar. The reason for that is that the collar is in one piece in the back, so you can't open the zipper all the way up, right? The only reason that you would ignore that and have the zipper go all the way to the top is if you're making a dress without a collar, okay? So like for that L'Amour dress back there, I ignored that and I had the zipper go all the way to the neckline, just like you would for any other dress, okay? But if you're using the collar, you're gonna want your zipper to stop at that mark. Okay, what's next? Let's talk about the sleeve. We made this fabulous gathered sleeve. You know, we love a statement sleeve. And so it's a nice big sleeve. It gathers at the top and then it gathers into a band, which I just noticed I'm missing that piece, but it's a rectangle and you can imagine what it looks like. So it just gathers into a straight band. All right, so this is very like 20s midi blouse inspired. Now, if you're not into that, there is a bias binding piece to finish this with a sleeveless look, just like the top I'm wearing now. All right, so let's talk about the collar pieces. You're going to have an upper collar and an under collar. So you're gonna have 2 pieces. You're going to cut this in your fabric. Great opportunity to use a contrast fabric, by the way, if you want to do like a black blouse and a white collar, or it's fun to use the same fabric too. So totally up to you, make it yours. But whichever fabric you choose, you are going to want to cut the upper collar in your interfacing as well. Those to the side. All right, let's talk about facings. We gave you a couple facing choices. This is a regular neckline facing, right? So you have your front neckline and your back neckline, and obviously those are not to scale, so don't be too worried about the fact that they look like they don't match. So these would be most blouse instances with sleeves, you're gonna be using these, all right? Or like the top I'm wearing today, I use this and then use the bias binding on the sleeve. Again, look at the instructions if you're confused about what to use for the design you're making. The all-in-one facing we provided for really just the instance of making something like the little more dress back here, where if you're going to be making a collarless bodice with no sleeves. So one very specific instance, but I love to have an all-in-one facing for that purpose. So we did include it really just for that opportunity for you guys. Okay, finally, bow pieces. Now, if you're going to make the knot tie, like the one I'm wearing today, you just need the sailor knot tie piece. I think it's just called the knot tie now. We were calling this the sailor blouse for a while, so that's why it says sailor blouse on there. So you've got your knot tie. You only need to cut one of these. And then if you're going to be making the gigantic bow, if you like a statement bow, then you're going to need all 3 of the gigantic bow pieces cut in your bow fabric. And we have a really fun surprise for you today. Melisha is going to be showing you how to sew these bows. So can't wait to have her on a little bit later. All right, so let's get into supplies next. All right, let's talk about supplies. So first, fabric. So for your top or your dress, you are going to be looking for a light to medium weight woven, not knit, fabric. Okay, so today I'm going to be using this really lovely lightweight cotton. It's like a 7-ounce cotton. I think it's the same one I used for the picnic skirt tutorial if you watched that one. And it's been in my stash for a while and it just has a really nice hand to it. But anything kind of crisp, things with sateen, or I'm sorry, like a sateen mixed with lycra would be a great choice too, just for comfort and movement. Anything with lycra built in is a great idea. Go take a look at our list of recommended fabrics because there's a lot of different things you could choose for this blouse. But this is what I'm going to be using today. You are also going to want to have a fusible interfacing for your collar, your sleeve band, and your facings. So today, to match this lightweight denim, I'm going to be using a lightweight weft interfacing, and we will give you the link for that in the instructions as always. And then you will want a fabric for your bows if you're choosing a bow. For the knot tie, which is the one I'm wearing today, you really want something that has some drape to it. So we used some silk crepe de chines for the photo shoot samples, which looked really beautiful. This is a rayon crepe. So anything with just a little bit of drape to it that will hang nicely. Now on the other end of the spectrum, for the gigantic bow, something that's crisp will really help define it and make it stand out because it's a statement bow. You can't hide from it. So why not just go with something like taffeta, a nice crisp sateen, poplin, something like that that's going to have some structure to it. Okay, so that is for your bow. And of course, if you're using a contrast fabric for your collar, you're going to want to select that as well. But I'm going to be making my collar and my blouse in the same denim. All right, so you are also going to want interfacing to stabilize your zipper opening. I love to use this stay tape, and we'll give you a link to this as well, but you could just as easily cut 1 1/4 inch wide strips of your fusible interfacing yardage for that, okay? So there's that, and then for thread, just make sure that you have thread to match your fabric and your ribbon trim if you're going to be using that, because you don't want to see contrast stitching on your ribbon. Speaking of ribbon, we are using this really beautiful 1/4 inch wide Petersham ribbon. And Petersham, if you're curious, is this ribbon that has the little scallops on the edge. It's similar to grosgrain, but grosgrain has a straight edge. And we have a great source for this in lots of different colors. So again, check the resources in the instructions. So whatever ribbon you use, the way we're sewing it on, you're going to see both sides of it. So just make sure that it looks the same on the front side as it does on the back side. Otherwise, you are going to see the wrong side exposed. You're also going to need a zipper for your top, a regular, not invisible zipper. For the top, you need a 14-inch zipper. If you're going to be making a dress that opens all the way to the neckline, then I think it's a 22-inch zipper, but don't quote me on that because it's in the instructions. In any case, you can buy a 22 or 24-inch zipper and cut it down for either the blouse or the dress. Okay, so that's it for supplies, and we're ready to get into sewing. Okay, so let's get started sewing. So let's talk about first steps and things that I've already done to prep. Obviously, cut out all my fabric pieces, and I did the first stay stitching step to stabilize the neckline. So I'm sure you guys know this by now if you've been on Patreon for a while, but when we do stay stitching, we do it at 1/2 inch and go directionally to center front to stabilize any biased portions of the neckline. So I did that on center front. Also did it on the 2 back pieces going from the shoulder to center back. Now, you also will want to stay stitch your princess seams on the front bodice. So from the shoulder down to the bottom bust notch. So not all the way to the waist, but the notch above the waist. Okay, so you're going to stabilize there, stay stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you'll see why later. And the other thing you're going to want to do is stabilize your zipper opening. So we're making the blouse today with sleeves and the collar, the whole thing. So that means I'm going to be ending the zipper at the circle mark on the upper back like we talked about, and I did my stay tape from that circle mark down to the hem. Okay, so just fuse that in place right there. Next thing we're going to do is stabilize the center front V point by stay stitching yet again a little bit lower right on the seam line at the pivot point. So I'm going to be upfront with you. The hardest part about sewing this blouse is this center point, because the 2 ends of the collar meet there, and then you also have a pivot point that has to look really crisp. So not impossible, and I'm going to give you some tips to make it look really great and be as simple as possible for you. And the first thing that I recommend doing is that there is a circle mark right at center front here. So if you go 5/8 of an inch in from one side, 5/8 of an inch from the other side, they meet at that circle mark. So I've drawn like a couple inches on each side in pencil. So what we're going to be doing is stabilizing again, stitching here with stay stitching, pivoting right at that circle mark, and then going up another 2 inches. So just 2 inches on either side of that center front circle mark. Okay, so we're going to start sewing on my marked line right here, regular 2.5 stitch length. I don't really need to back stitch. Now be very careful when you get to that center front point. This is where you're going to pivot. See that stitching right there, and you can kind of see in my stay stitching, it's not so neat. It doesn't matter, it's never going to show, but with this stitching down here, you want to be very, very precise, okay, because this is where your V point is going to be on your blouse. So if it's off at all, it's going to look off when you wear it, and it's going to bother you. So take your time on this step. Okay, next thing we're going to do, and this is going to feel really weird, is you're going to clip with some sharp scissors all the way to that center front point, but not through your stitching, obviously. So as close as you can without clipping through it, okay? So we still have that stay stitching here to stabilize the bias, and then this V point here will help us sew on our collar in future steps. Okay, let's talk about how to sew these princess seams. So if you've watched any of my videos with princess seams before, you'll probably know my method, which is, I feel like, the stay stitching step we did and now the clipping step we're going to do are really important. So on your center front piece, you have your stay stitching at 1/2 inch down to that lower bust notch. And what we're gonna do now is make little clips with our scissors every 1/2 inch. And this is going to help us match two very different shapes. As you can see, the edge of this piece is very straight, but we're going to be sewing it to a super curvy piece. And the higher your cup size, the more curvy it's going to be. All right, so this is what we're sewing this piece too. So you can see you've got a very pronounced curve on the bodice side front and then very straight edge on the center front. So now that we've done these clips, it's going to be a lot easier to sew these pieces together. So you're going to put them right sides together, match them at the shoulder, match any notches. And then you're going to spread these clips to match that really pronounced curve. So they're going to have to open up a little bit here, like this. And now those two pieces will fit together. I'm going to go ahead and sew this at 5/8 of an inch. So starting at the bottom. And around this curve, you're just going to continue to let those clips spread open. Okay, so look how beautiful that seam is going to look. What you're going to do next is finish these two seam allowances as one. I'm going to be using my serger just because I find it like a really fast, professional looking seam finish. So I'm going to finish these together as one, trimming the seam allowance down to about 3/8 of an inch. And after I do that, I'm going to sew the other princess seam. I'm going to finish flat my side seam, right? Just the single layer, shoulder seams. I'm going to repeat the princess seam process on the back for the back princess seams. You've already seen one, so it's the same process. It just has a less pronounced curve because there's no bust curve. All right, so you're going to do your princess seams, finish those seam allowances on the princess seams, side seams, and shoulder seams, and then we'll meet back here. Okay, everyone, so let's talk about the last few steps we did and where we are and where we're going. Okay, so I've sewn my front and back princess seams. I finished them as one on my serger, trimming them down to about 3/8 of an inch. And then I pressed my seams towards center front. Okay. The next thing I did was I finished any raw edges, the vertical raw edges on the top. So the side seams without trimming anything away. Same on my shoulders. And then for my back pieces, I did the princess seams just like for the front, finished them, pressed them towards center back, and then did my finishing on the sides and the shoulder. Next thing we're gonna do is kind of see this whole thing come together into the top, right? So no sleeves, no collar yet, but we're gonna have the basic top. All right, so we're gonna put these two back pieces right sides together. And because I'm doing a collar, we're going to sew this center back seam down to the circle mark. Now, if you're doing a different version, make sure that you are following the instructions for the version you've chosen, because as I said in the intro, we really went with a choose your own adventure format for this pattern. There are a lot of different garments you can make with this one design. So make sure that you're following the instructions and using the steps for the garment that you've chosen, okay? But that said, if you're making the same style I am, you are going to be sewing your center back seam right now. So I'm going to go to my machine and sew this at 5/8 of an inch, back stitch, and then I'm going to finish stitching at the circle mark, or where my stabilizer starts. So back stitch right there. And then below this is where your zipper is going to be inserted. Okay, so you can press this open now. Of course, my iron turned off, but you get the idea. Press that open, and then you're gonna sew your shoulder seams and your side seams. Okay, so I'm going to put these right sides together, and I'm going to match up these shoulder seams. Make sure that your princess seams match there, right? Match up the shoulder seams, sew them at 5/8 of an inch, and then same thing with the side seams. Match those notches. So underarm down to hem. Okay, and so again, if you're confused about the steps for your design, for your adventure, make sure you're reading those instructions as we go. All right, so next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna sew those seams, press them open, and then we're gonna come back and sew the collar. Very exciting, we're moving right along. All right, everyone, we are ready to move on to our collar. So you're gonna want to have both your upper collar and your under collar cut, and then your interfacing applied to your upper collar. Now we're gonna put the two pieces together, right sides together, and then we're going to pin, oh, that's a huge pin, pin all the way around the outer edges. And I know we've talked about this before, probably in the Gardener top video, since that was our merit badge. Our merit badge that month was collars. We talked about why there is an upper collar and an under collar and the difference between the two. So if you remember that, you're going to know that there's going to be a size difference. The under collar is going to be slightly smaller so that it can roll to the underneath of the collar and you won't see the seam line on the edge. So same principle at work here. And you're just going to want to match the raw edges and then just kind of ease them together when you're sewing. So just keep pinning and see how there's like a little more excess on the bottom. And you're going to sew with the interface side on the bottom, so the upper collar on the bottom, which will help ease that excess in with the feed dogs. All right. Oh, hi, Hattie. Hattie just came over to say hello. So she's looking at me very expectantly right now. Why don't you go back to bed? We're filming a video. Okay, so we're gonna start stitching right here and stitch around the 3 outer edges. This inner curve right here is going to become the neckline edge, so we're gonna leave that open. Okay, let's try this again. We're gonna stitch the outer edge starting at using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Making sure that those raw edges are aligned. And we have 2 pivot points here. This is our first one, so you'll stop with your needle down, pivot to turn that corner. And to ease that larger upper collar in, it can kind of help to use your right hand and just kind of hold these layers taut, like kind of flip them this way, like turn them up with your right hand. And that will help ease them together. Second pivot point. Okay, so we're ready to trim and grade our seam allowances and clip those corners. So what you're going to want to do is have the non-interfaced collar or the under collar facing up, and this is going to be the seam allowance that we trim slightly shorter. So I would trim this one down to about 1/8 of an inch. And then we're going to trim the interface seam allowance or the upper collar about 1/8 of an inch taller than that. So about 1/4 inch wide on that one. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way around the collar in this way. So now we can turn it right side out. So nice big opening there to turn it through. And I'm just going to use my fingernail to just kind of turn that corner right side out. So you can get the corner as crisp as possible. You can even use a pin to just kind of pull it out here. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, now we're going to understitch our collar. So we are going to start on one of these long edges, and we're not going to be able to understitch in these corners right here because it's such a tight area. So we're going to have to break our stitching to do this shorter back edge of the collar. Okay, so let me get situated here. I'm going to open out the under collar from the upper collar, and I'm going to make sure the seam allowances are oriented towards the under collar, or the one without interfacing. And I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch from the seam line. Go as far as I can and then backstitch. Trim those little threads. And now just pick it up again on the other side of that little corner. Again, getting as close as you can to the corner, but it gets tight in there, so don't worry too much about getting right in the corner. And I'm going to continue understitching like that and just go all the way around, again skipping this little corner right here where I can't get inside the corner. So this understitching is going to help us get a nice crisp edge when we press it, which is what we're going to do right now. All right, so you're going to roll the seam line to the outer edge of the collar, just really push it out there. Again, just use your fingers to roll the edge of the understitching out to the edge of the collar. And see, this is going to help us get a nice, crisp, finished edge on our collar. All right, so let me finish pressing this side. And this is the upper collar, so it's got a little wrinkly over here, so I'm going to give it a nice press here, because you want this to be nice and smooth. Obviously, this is the big statement of the sailor collar, is this lovely back collar. All right, so next thing we're going to do before we do the trim on the sailor collar is to baste this neck edge closed so that it's easier to sew to the blouse when we get there. So just pin these raw edges together around this curved neckline edge. And you can baste this together at 1/2 inch using a nice long stitch length, like 5 millimeters. And this is a funny corner. And again, we're getting back to why this top is a little tricky to sew at center front, is you've just got some strange little seam allowances and intersections here. So you can see if I'm at 5/8 of an inch, I'm right on the edge of this piece right here. So don't let that freak you out. Just keep sewing. We're just basting right now. And you can even be more like 1/2 inch for your basting seam allowance. Okay, so we have a beautiful sailor collar here ready to go. And if you're not applying trim, you can skip this next section, but I do want to show you how to do this beautiful sailor collar trim. So I'm going to change my thread on my machine to the same color as my ribbon, and then I'll talk you through applying the ribbon trim to the collar. Okay, so let's apply our ribbon to our sailor collars. So as I mentioned in the supply chapter, we are using this 1/4 inch Petersham ribbon, which is really nice because it looks the same on both sides and has this really pretty scalloped edge. Also comes in a lot of really beautiful colors, and we found a great source for it, so do check out the link in the instructions. So really, all you gotta do here is measure from the outer edge of the collar, the finished outer edge, and you're going to be applying the ribbon 1/2 inch away from the edge. So I just pin mine in place. I know some people might feel like they want to baste it first and have a little more security and maybe mark it first, but I feel like this is one of those things where you can, you know, do your best at measuring and place it the best you can, and it will look great. So don't worry too much about it being, you know, down to the 64th of an inch. Just make sure it looks nice and uniform. Get it? Get it? That's a sailor pun. Because it's a sailor, it would be a sailor uniform. Okay, so this little corner, I was so confused about how we were going to do this because I thought it was going to have to be mitered, and then Melisha was working on these samples and she didn't even understand why I thought it was complicated. She just did this, she just like flipped it and it looks great. So we're calling this the flip and fold method. So you're just going to take that ribbon and turn it to the wrong side, and that's why we're using a ribbon that looks the same on the right and wrong side of the ribbon, because obviously if there were a discernible wrong side, it wouldn't look great when you did this. So I'm going to continue around in this way, and I'm going to do a little flip and fold at my opposite corner. Just coming to this opposite edge over here, you just want to make sure to maintain that uniform 1/2 an inch from the edge. You don't need to taper it in to 0 at center front or anything like that. And there we go. All right, so I'm going to trim this ribbon off, and now we're going to edge stitch the ribbon in place. So you need to stitch on both sides of this little 1/4 inch ribbon. So this is why I switched to red thread, so it'll blend in. You really don't want contrasting. I mean, you could, but I feel like this is a place to let the ribbon shine rather than the stitching. So I am using red thread, and I am using an edge stitch foot. On Bernina, that's the number 10 foot, which I'm sure I've talked about on these videos before. I really like it, but you can also substitute a blind hem foot. It has this nice blade down the center, and you can adjust the position of your needle so it's slightly to the left of the blade. Line the blade up with the edge of your ribbon. Use a straight stitch at 2.5 millimeters long. And now we're just going to stitch along one edge of the ribbon. Let's talk about the little flip and fold corner here. You are just going to have to do a little slight pivot so that you're stitching along that slanted edge of the folded ribbon. So just take your time, use your hand wheel if you need to. And now we're going to do another small pivot and continue along this edge of the ribbon. there's one side of the ribbon edge stitched. And now we're going to do the same thing along the opposite side of the ribbon. So with this edge stitch foot, I'm going to be stitching from the other side, right? So I need to switch my needle to the other side of the blade. And just same thing on this other side of the ribbon, and you're going to do just a simple pivot point at the inner corner of the flip and fold action on the ribbon. Okay, see how pretty that looks? So I do just want to talk you through if you want to apply a second row of trim, which is what I did on this top. For the photo shoot samples, we just did one row and it looks great that way. But I got curious because a lot of vintage sailor dresses have 2 or even 3 rows of trim, what it would look like. And I think it looks really cute. So what you can do is do the same thing, but this time just put a 1/4 inch of space between your 2 rows of ribbon. And then you're going to do the same thing with flipping and folding at that inner edge. And then you will have a beautiful double row of trim. Okay, so after you have your trim applied to your collar, you are going to pin the collar to the neckline edge. Now remember when earlier I said that this is the trickiest part of this top. I'm gonna really talk you through it and explain every little step of it. So you should have notches on your collar on the neckline edge which match the shoulder seams of the top on the neckline. All right, so you can go ahead and pin those. And it's really just the center front point that's a little bit tricky, but I think we've landed on an easy way for you to do it. Okay, so a few pins around the back neckline. And now let's concentrate on this center front point. Okay, so, and let me get some of these threads out of the way. All right, so if you think back to some of the first steps that we did, remember this line of stay stitching that we did at the seam allowance and then we pivoted at the center front circle mark, okay? So, and then we clipped to it. So we have this V shape right here. And now we have these collar ends. Now, what you need to know about the collar ends is that they only have an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance on the very end here, okay? So, and you may recall that there was a circle mark right there on the pattern piece. So what's gonna happen now is you're going to align the raw edge of the collar and the neckline edge here. And then at center front, at that center front clip point, your collar is just going to extend an 1/8 of an inch past that center front circle, okay? So you should really just have the tiniest little overlap with these 2 sides of the collar. So let me fill a few pins in there and let's look at the other side. Okay, so you're going to match these raw edges. And then again, just an 1/8 of an inch extended past that center front mark right here, the center front circle. So what's gonna happen is there's gonna be that slight little overlap of the 2 ends of the collar here, okay? And so now we're gonna baste these in place. using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And this split that we cut into the fabric here is going to help us sew around this point. And you can start stitching at that center front point using a long basting stitch. Start on one side, and then when you go around the other side, just kind of overlap them, oops, and stitch them in place. Okay, so here I'm going around the outer edge, basting all those layers together. So really just basting the top. I'm basting the collar to the top right now. And when I get back around to center front again, we'll take a look at that tricky point. Okay, now we're coming back up to center front again. And what I like about having this clip at center front is that I can kind of straighten out this. I mean, you don't want to pull too much, obviously, but you can straighten it out so you're not dealing with a really tricky little inverted point here. So just come to that center front V point, and you want the edges of the collar to meet and just slightly overlap at the center front circle. And I'm just gonna backstitch a little there to secure. So the beauty of this is that you can now take a look at what you've done, and if you feel like it's not quite secure, you could even go with a little hand stitching there, a little hand basting. You could do you could secure it a little bit better right there. But this is what you're looking for, those points to just meet right at center front right there. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is talk about the facing unit, which is going to get sandwiched on top of this. Okay, now that you have basted your collar onto your top, we are going to sew our neckline facings and then apply the neckline facings on top of the collar. So it's like a little sandwich. So I've already gone ahead and assembled my neckline facing. So all I had to do was a seam at center back, and then at the shoulder seams, seamed the back facing unit to the front neckline facing. Now you may see here that, remember that line of stay stitching that we did at center front on the blouse to the circle mark? There is another circle mark on the facing center front V point, and I did the same exact thing here where I stay stitched for about 2 inches on either side, pivoting at that circle mark. And now, again, same thing, I'm going to clip to that center front circle mark on my facing without clipping through my stitching, just like I did on the top itself. All right, so now let's create our little sandwich. We're gonna grab our blouse, and I'm going to put the facing unit right sides together with the blouse. And again, I like to start by matching my shoulder seams here. Oh, you may also note that I did a line of serging around the outer edge of the facing to finish it, have it look nice and neat. And we're going to be stitching from the inside of the blouse, so just keep that in mind because we want to be following our original stay stitching at that point. So this is the tricky point right here that we've been talking about all day. Right there. So put one little pin right at your circle mark at center front. Make sure all your layers are where you want them to be. So you want those circle marks to be matching each other, and then your collar points here. And you want to make sure that your collar points are not creeping out to the outside of the blouse, because what can happen here is you can sew your facing, turn it right side out, and then you see you actually have a little seam allowance or, you know, raw edge of fabric peeking out there. It's nothing you can't fix, but, you know, might as well just check for it now. Okay, so we're gonna stitch from the blouse side here. And I am gonna fix that seam allowance first, but what you see here is one of my seam allowances got turned in right there. So let me fix that real quick. These were all basting stitches, so I can just go ahead and fix that. Put a new pin there. All right, so you can start stitching. Actually, why don't we start stitching at this shoulder? And look, that one, I did not turn in the seam allowance. So we're gonna start stitching here, and then we'll be going towards our center front point, and I will explain to you how to deal with that. Okay, so from the inside of the top, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm starting at one shoulder seam, my regular stitch length. I'm gonna back stitch. I'm on one V side on the front here, approaching my center front point where the collar meets. And now you can see that clip and where I put my little pin right there. So here's my original stay stitching right here, and I'm going to follow that, stitching just to the outside of that line, approaching my center front circle point, and I'm going to stop there with my needle down. And this is a pivot point, so I'm going to raise my presser foot. I'm going to get all of this excess out of the way to the left here and continue stitching to the other side. And that's it. It's not that bad, but we do need to go, after we turn the facing to the inside, we'll just do a check to make sure that it looks good. I'm going to continue around to where I started and then backstitch. Okay, so this is our moment of truth right now. I'm going to check how it looks at center front. And don't worry, if yours doesn't look good, you can go back and fix it now, but now's the time to sort of troubleshoot and check your work. So just give it a shot turning in the facing. And what you're looking for is you don't want to see any seam allowances exposed at center front, and just kind of like test out what it's going to look like once you turn the collar in and grade and everything. So if you don't see any exposed seam allowances there, you don't see any raw edges of fabric, you're good to go. So next thing we're going to do is grade our seam allowances. We have a lot of layers going on here. So you're going to trim these down into different widths of the seam allowances. So the facing would be the shortest one. The collar layers would be slightly taller than that, like that. And then the top itself will be the longest one, about just a hair taller than the one before it. So you're creating these levels. All right, so I'm gonna go all the way around my neckline edge, creating that graded seam allowance. Okay, so now that I've done all of my grading, I'm going to go in and do some clipping around these inner curves at the back neckline. So just about every 1/2 inch. little clip. And then when that when that seam starts to straighten out, then you can stop clipping. All right, so you can probably guess what's next if you've watched a few of my videos. We are going to understitch the facing. So you're going to open out the facing from the top itself. And let's start at a shoulder seam, just like we did when we were sewing on the facing. And what you want to do is open out the facing, make sure that your seam allowances are underneath where you're going to be stitching right here. So they need to be oriented towards the facing. And we're going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. Now when you approach your center front point, you're going to have another pivot situation here. So stop with your needle down once you get to that point where your circle was at center front, where all those layers kind of meet right here, and then get your excess out of the way after you pivot, and then continue going in the opposite direction. Okay, so now that we've finished understitching, we want to give the neckline a nice press. So it's nice to use a ham or something where you can kind of raise it up and really see what you're doing. Turn the facing back to the inside of the top. And just really give it a good press like this. And the center front point, yet again, is the trickiest part. So you just want to make sure that you turn that collar to the outside, get a nice little fold going there. So that looks like that. But yeah, it kind of resists folding here at center front. So you got to just work with it a little bit. Okay, now when you get to center front, you want to spend a little time here. What I would do is put the ham inside the top itself. Arrange that facing underneath there. And get everything looking exactly how you want it to look, and then give it a press from the right side. Now, I will warn you, if you have fabric that you're concerned about being damaged or get shiny spots or anything like that from the right side, then you'll want to use a press cloth here. But just spend a little time making that center front point look the way you want it to look. And you can see I got some wrinkles down here, so I can spend a little time just steaming that, hopefully not getting more wrinkles, and just concentrating on that center front point and giving it a little bit of steam. All right, but I can come back to that. I do want to spend a little more time with it, but you don't need to watch me. So what I want to say next is that you can do a little stitch in the ditch action here to hold these facings in place on the inside of the top. So you can just kind of put the collar out of the way again, and then pin through the layers. So I'm securing the facing on the inside, pin through the layers like this, and then we are going to stitch in the ditch to hold the facing in place, just to avoid hand stitching here. You know, you can tack them by hand if you like, but a little quicker to do it by machine. And just make sure you're stitching right in the ditch of the seam line. Okay, so you can repeat that stitch in the ditch move at the other shoulder seam and also at center back, because we have a center back seam. So just underneath the collar, you would do a little line of stitching in the ditch. All right, so your collar is now on, your facing is applied, and the next thing we're going to do is work on the sleeves. All right, so let's get started sewing our sleeves. So I'm going to be doing this lovely statement sleeve that has gathers at the top and also at the bottom and it's finished with a band at the bottom. Very 20s midi blouse inspired. So you have two pieces. You have this large sleeve piece and then a little rectangle that needs to be interfaced, and this is your sleeve band. First thing we're going to do is sew our underarm seam on our sleeve. So let's just pin this together. And we're gonna do just a regular 5/8 of an inch seam here. And now we can press this open. You can put a seam roll in there, but actually the sleeve is big enough that you're not even going to accidentally press these edges if you just press up the center like this. So that's nice. Okay, and now we're going to do our gathering stitches on the sleeve cap and the sleeve hem. So on your pattern, you should have had dots to guide you in your gathering. So we're going to gather just between the sets of dots on the curved upper arm cap and then also along the bottom. It's pretty much you're gathering the entire hem of the sleeve. So I'm just going to get you started here. You're going to go to a long gathering stitch, so between 4 and 5 millimeters. Start stitching at one circle with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, leaving yourself some long thread tails. Ending at that second circle. And now we're going to do our second row of gathering stitches at a 1/4 inch right inside the first. So same place you started stitching, do a 1/4 inch. All right, I'm going to do the same thing around the sleeve hem, 2 rows of gathering stitches. Start right next to the underarm seam that we just sewed. Get those seam allowances out of the way because you don't want to catch them in your gathering stitches. Okay, so now that I have 2 rows of gathering stitches on the sleeve cap and 2 at the hem, we are going to put this to the side and work on the sleeve band. Now you're going to fold this in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together and press it to crease it. You can also turn in one seam allowance on the long edge. Turn in 5/8 of an inch here. Again, just to crease. And then we're going to sew this into a ring. So put these, what you just creased, fold it right back out, but you have the crease there. And now you're going to put these short ends together and we're going to form a ring. So stitch at 5/8 of an inch. You were just gathering, so make sure you adjust your stitch length back to a seam stitch length, so about 2.5. And then we're going to press this seam allowance open. All right, now you can kind of put this to the side, put that sleeve band to the side, and now we're going to work on the sleeve hem. So, working from the inside, you'll notice that you have one notch right here, which is going to help you match the sleeve hem to the sleeve band, but you're just going to start gathering, so just pulling up those bobbin threads from your gathering stitches. There's a lot of threads going on here, but just start to pull up your gathers. And it's going to need to match the sleeve band, so you can always just keep the sleeve band kind of close for reference on how much you need to gather it. I'm going to start from the other side now. Okay, and when it looks about right, we can then grab our sleeve band. And so the side that I didn't turn in the seam allowance on, you're going to place, you're going to take the sleeve and you're going to put the sleeve inside the band with that unpressed edge matching the raw edge that we just gathered. Start by matching the sleeve band seam to the underarm seam on the sleeve. Place a pin. And now you can kind of distribute your gathers throughout here. So you should have a notch to match, like I just mentioned. There should be a notch to match roughly opposite the underarm seam. And then you're just going to distribute your gathers so that they look nice and even. Okay, so now we're going to sew these together. And you can use the free arm on your machine like I am, or you can stitch from the inside of the ring if you don't have a free arm. Now you can just check your gathers, so flip out that sleeve band and just make sure they all look nice and even, and if you're happy with them, then you can flip it back in and trim down your seam allowances. So you can do some grading here. So I would trim the sleeve band the shortest, and then the sleeve itself slightly taller. Okay, so now that I have graded my seam allowances, I can flip the sleeve band out. And here it's a little easier to work from the inside of the sleeve, so you can turn it right side out. You can use a seam roll here if you like. Helps press this area. And we're going to press these seam allowances toward the sleeve band. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is turn the cuff back in the way we pressed it a couple steps ago. Remember those crease lines we pressed? And turn it back in along that crease line, turn in the seam allowance. And the seam allowance, this fold, should just cover your seam line that you just made when you stitched the sleeve to the band. And what we're going to do next is stitch in the ditch. So turn that seam allowance in all the way around. And now we can work from the right side again. And what I like to do for this step is just with my left hand, I'm just checking that my seam allowances are covering the seam line, and I'm putting a pin where I'm going to stitch through the ditch. So you just want to make sure that you're actually going to catch that seam allowance back there when you do the stitch in the ditch. Because that's, I mean, I feel like that's the one bummer about stitching in the ditch, is sometimes you don't know if you're actually catching the seam allowance behind there. So if you just do this pinning step, it should help, because you're sort of, you know, checking yourself before you start stitching that everything is aligned the way it needs to be. Of course, you can always go back and fix it, you know, if you miss a spot or anything like that. All right. So we're going to stitch in the ditch right here. Of course, I put my pins going the wrong way, so maybe don't be like me and put your pins going the opposite direction. And we're going to stitch right in the ditch right here, catching that seam allowance on the inside of the band. And just make sure your gathers stay arranged the way you want them to. Slow. And I'm also using my right hand now to just continually check that my seam allowances underneath are where they need to be so that they get caught in my stitching. And there we go. All right, so now you'll just check that you're happy with your stitching in the ditch, but what you should see, let's find some better light here to look at this. What you should see is that your sleeve band is nice and neat on the outside, and then you turn it to the inside and you have a line of stitching where it's securing that seam allowance. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is set in the sleeve. Okay, so now that we have applied the sleeve band, we can set the sleeve into the blouse. So first let's pull up our gathering stitches from the inside. So those bobbin threads, just like we did on the hem, you're just gonna create those gathers. Same from the other side. Okay, so now that you have created your gathers on the sleeve cap, we're going to set it into the blouse. So grab your blouse and just like you would set in any sleeve, you're going to match your underarm seams first. I always like to pin from the inside of the blouse, and then we're going to flip to the inside. Find your shoulder notch here and match it to your shoulder seam. And then you have your arm side notches, single notch in the front, double notch in the back. And you should also have your gathering notches to match up to each other. So lots of points to help you here. And now you can just distribute the gathers more evenly along the sleeve cap. And then pin. Okay. Just make sure you don't have any spots that are just too sparse, you know. You don't want an area without gathers. So just distribute evenly. And now we're going to sew these together. So again, using the free arm. You guys notice I always use the free arm on this machine, and it really bugs people on YouTube. I get a lot of comments asking me why I don't put the flatbed extension on this machine. And the answer is that this machine has a really weird flatbed that just goes on the back, and I hate putting it on and I hate taking it off, and I've just gotten used to sewing without it, and this is how I like to sew on this machine. So if you see one of those comments, now you know the answer. All right, so we're going to sew this in the round. So once your sleeve is on, you can just do a double check that you're happy with how your gathers look from the right side. If they look good to you, then your sleeve is on. And the final thing to do is to finish these seam allowances as one. So I always do mine on my serger, and I will trim it down to about 3/8 of an inch as I'm finishing. So all the way around, and then the sleeve gets flipped out and the seam allowances get pressed towards the sleeve. So I'm gonna go ahead and set in my opposite sleeve, and then we're ready to do the hem and then the zipper. And so we're almost there. We are ready to hem our tops. So let's take a look at this top back. We have the collar on, and then this center back seam ending at the upper back at that circle. Now, the zipper is going to go in here upside down, but we're gonna hem the blouse first. So I do want to say this is a little unusual, but if you've ever sewn the Rita blouse, which I feel like a lot of you have, you've done these steps before, but we're going to be doing a lap zipper rather than an invisible zipper, which is what the Rita blouse has because its zipper is on the side. But really similar in concept. We want to finish the hem before we put in the zipper. So we are going to do a line of guide stitching at 1/4 inch all the way around the hem with the seam allowances. This is where we did the stabilization for the zipper opening. So we're going to, I'm going to do it from the inside so you can see my stitching. At 1/4 inch, you don't need to back stitch, all the way around. Iron going again. And what we're going to do is turn this up once using the guide stitching as our guide. And the guide stitching should just be to the inside of the top. And then we're going to turn and press again and then stitch along the edge of this fold here. So I feel like you've got this. I'm gonna go ahead and finish my hem. You do yours. So again, just turn in once, turn in again, and then edge stitch along the fold. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about inserting the zipper. So I have finished my hem, and now we are ready to do our zipper, which excitingly is pretty much the final step in this top aside from doing the bows. Okay, so the great thing about this, the order of construction with this top, is that by the time you get to the zipper and then you put it in, you're pretty much done. So that's nice. So what I've done is I've turned in my seam allowances at center back. Now, if you've done a lap zipper before, then hopefully you know that the right side is always the underlap side, and you turn that in 1/2 inch. The left side is the overlap side, and you're gonna turn that in 5/8 of an inch, okay? So as you're looking at your blouse, I'll turn it around here so it's more like up and down for your view. 1/2 inch on the right side, 5/8 of an inch on the left side, okay? And one thing I did was I did a little clip. See how it's very curvy at the waist because of that sort of peplum shape there? You can do a little clip there so that it doesn't buckle on the outside when you sew it. Okay, so everything about this is just like sewing a regular lap zipper, except that it's upside down, okay? Because we normally, you know, the top of the zipper would be up here on a dress, but because we need it to open from the bottom, the zipper pull is going to be at the hem. So you're gonna start by pinning your underlap side or the right side. And what you wanna do is align that metal stop so that it's just above the bottom of the finished hem. And then you're gonna put some pins in, and we're gonna be sewing from the bottom of the hem up towards the neckline, okay? Always in that direction. So I'm gonna turn it around now that we've gotten our, what's the expression? Now that we've found our bearings, let's say that. Okay, so I just turned in the top of the zipper tape, and I'm gonna sew it by machine to hold it in place there. You can also do that part by hand. All right, so the zipper is going just behind the seam allowances, and then the folded edge of the seam allowance is matching just next to the zipper teeth, okay? So it does not overlap at all. It should be just next to it. And just keep pinning from the hem up to where that circle mark was, where you closed your center back seam at the neckline. Okay, and here's where my seam closes up at the circle mark. So I'm going to stop hitting there. And now what you can do is open your zipper pull about halfway, and now we're going to stitch the zipper to the top on this side. So I've already installed a zipper foot on my machine, and I need to make sure that it's on the right side here so that I am stitching as close to the zipper teeth as possible. I'm gonna get myself started with the hand wheel here. There's a lot of bulk. Make sure you don't stitch on that metal part. And stitching about 1/8 of an inch from the fold of fabric. Holding everything nice and taut. When you get close to the zipper pull, you can stop with your needle down, lift your presser foot, and close the zipper just to get it out of your way. And I just backstitched at that point where that upper back seam starts. Okay, so there's 1/2 of your zipper done, very exciting. Now we're going to do the overlap side. So let me just trim these threads. Okay, so I closed the zipper all the way, and the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to take the overlap seam allowance and we're going to have it covering the zipper. All right, so you're gonna take it so it just covers the zipper pull, and we're going to pin to the right of the zipper teeth. Okay, so this fold here should be just covering your stitching that you just did. And again, you want to pin to the right of the teeth. So you should be able to lift up a flap here and see the zipper underneath. And if you've ever done a lap zipper in a skirt or a dress before, again, it's the same process. It just feels a little weird because we are doing it totally upside down. But I would say don't think too much about that part, because if you do, you're gonna start getting really weirded out and think you're doing it wrong, which is what happened to me. But if you just think of it as a regular lap zipper, you're just stitching it from the bottom up and the opening is at the bottom, you'll be totally fine. And the other thing to remember is that we're always going to be stitching from the top of the zipper, which is at the hem, the other way, okay? So you don't want to stitch starting at the upper back and going down. Always stitch from the hem up. All right, so I'm going to try to turn in this little flap on the zipper tape here. And what's going to happen is the zipper pull is going to hang down like this. So if you've ever had a blouse that opens on the side, you probably see a zipper pull hanging like that. Okay, so now that that's pinned in place, if you're not sure if you did it correctly, a good way to check yourself is to try to open the zipper. And if you can't open it all the way, it means you pinned it wrong somehow. And usually what I see people doing is they accidentally pin it to the they pin it shut, right? So they pin to the left of the teeth. So go back and fix that if that happened to you. But if not, we're ready to start sewing the side. So I'm going to open the pull all the way, and I'm going to move my needle to the other side of my zipper foot. And I'm gonna stitch this side. Feels very weird because normally I would be stitching on the opposite side. So 3/8 of an inch is your seam allowance. So if you don't have marks on this side, maybe put a piece of tape or something. back stitch here. It's always hardest getting started with all this bulk right here, so I kind of try to help it move through a little bit. But just above all, you know, try to keep everything very nice and smooth. Like think of it as like a tabletop that you're trying to keep very smooth to avoid getting any buckles. And yeah, this is my seam allowance on this side. Once you get close to the zipper pull, you can stop with your needle down. Again, lift up the presser foot back down. And when you get to where the seam closes right there, you can pivot. Raise your presser foot would help. And stitch across the upper edge of the zipper. Okay, so it's a little different doing a zipper that way, but hopefully it makes sense to you. It feels a little counterintuitive to me. And, you know, I will say, unlike me, now would definitely not be the time to use a contrast zipper. You want this to blend in as much as possible. So see how mine is rippling just a little bit up here? I'm going to try to correct that with some steam. And it looks like that helped. Of course, my iron is spitting water everywhere right now, but this is kind of what I'm looking for. So you just want a nice, smooth zipper overlap. But yeah, I would have your zipper color blend in a little bit better, but I wanted you guys to be able to see it. So there we have it. That is your installed zipper. So everything's pretty much done except for attaching your bow. So let's talk about that in the next chapter. Okay, everyone, you just installed your zippers, and we're gonna talk bows for just a second because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we have two options for the bow, the knot tie, which is what I'm wearing, and then the gigantic bow, which was inspired by a vintage photograph that we all fell in love with here. So it's a statement piece. But what's great this month is that we have a separate video with the lovely Melisha showing you how to sew each of these bows. So if you would like to be taken step by step through the bow sewing, please go check that out. It will be in a separate post. And then come back and you will have a finished bow. I think I'm gonna put the knot tie on this blouse. And really you're just going to, and what I should have said earlier too, is that anything that happens with this point here, the bows will cover a lot of sins right here. So we are going to attack a bow right there at that V point. So you're gonna do it by hand. And I would lift up the facing and just do some hand stitching right through there. So that's the final step on this top. It looks complicated, but I feel like it comes together surprisingly easily. Do check out the instructions because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of different options for the way that you can sew this pattern, from a L'Amour style cocktail dress, sleeveless with a draped skirt, to a very classic sailor blouse with this midi blouse sleeve. So I hope you love this pattern. This has been a really fun month. We have learned sailor collars. We've learned how to do that really fiddly little point. We've learned sailor trim. We've learned how to do an upside down lapped zipper. So much this month. And I just want to thank you all for being patrons, and just worth mentioning that your support helps us do this every single month, bringing you a brand new pattern and a new video. So thank you so much for being part of this Patreon. And I hope you love the videos and the pattern, and we will see you next time. Ahoy! Goodbye.